I always knew that the Owl House was ending, considering of how much that the third season only had less to offer compared to the previous two seasons. But at the same time, I've made a community post about possibly reviewing the season 3 episodes in one video, similar to Shadow Showdown, Steven Universe, and OKKO. And after taking some time and after watching all 3 of these specials, I took the time to reconsider that idea, which is why that this video is called Lonely Reviews The Owl House Fantasy Trilogy. And the reason why I call it Fantasy Trilogy is because, well, the main character Luz is into fantasy, and she's much of a weirdo as the other characters. To be honest, me reviewing the final episode, Watching and Dreaming, just didn't feel enough, considering that the other 2 episodes, thanks to them and for the future, really felt important when it comes to how the production had to not really tone down, but take down some ideals in order to squeeze everything into these episodes from season 3. And just by watching these specials one by one, I'm starting to convince that season 3 would have been a lot more than just 3 specials. Like, it does have some great moments, but at the same time, it could have been a lot more. But let's get into the first episode, thanks to them. With this special taking place after the events of the final episode of Season 2, Camellia takes care of Luz along with her 4 friends. And trust me when I say this, upon watching this special from beginning to end, not only it gave me Euphemia Season 3 vibes from the first half, obviously, but for me personally, with this being mostly a Halloween episode, I'm starting to convince that the Owl House were planning to do a Halloween episode, but they decided to squish Halloween into this, considering that they were forced to scrap plans due to Disney executives not giving them more respect than they should have. You know, I'm gonna be really honest with you, whenever I think about Halloween in this episode, considering that this episode came out during the Halloween season last year, the production pretty much wanted to do a Halloween episode involving Luz and her friends in the human world. Granted, I wouldn't be excited, but at the same time, judging of how much passion they're doing in this episode along with the following 2 episodes, it really shows. I'm gonna be really honest with you, with this episode's pacing, it really tries a lot in order to make us feel invested for nearly all the characters. And believe me, every single character in this really felt like that they're putting their goals to the test or putting their instincts to the test in order to get back to the boring Isles. Luz is afraid of losing her friends, considering that she helped Belos, all the while that Hunter is afraid, considering that he is the son of Belos, also becoming his witch hunting partner. If I'm gonna be really honest with you, thinking about these 2 characters and how they're being handicapped at the moment, I really felt like that Hunter's insecurities is mainly of how his life would have been a lot more different if he ended up on the bad guy's side, while Luz's predicament without the assistance of Hunter would have been a lot more different if she didn't know who Belos was. And believe me, the more I think about it, I can totally understand onto why Luz and Hunter are working together in the middle of this special. When it comes to Camellia, considering that she's getting development in this, knowing full well that her only appearance was in Yesterday's Lies, mainly of her being the main character, I'm gonna be really honest with you, I honestly thought that Camellia was probably gonna be like the other moms, who are mostly supportive and not righteous like Luz is. So just by watching her in this, along with her presence in the following episode, it kind of shows that whole life just isn't the same as everyone else's when it comes to being a parent. Believe me when I say this. I was going into this blind, not realizing that Camellia wasn't going to be this type of character ever since I saw how she was executed in Yesterday's Lie. When it comes to everything else, mainly Amity and the others learning of what the human world is like, this is basically Amphibia, but with the Owl House from the first part of Season 3. Like, I understand that this is bound to happen when it comes to characters like Amity and the others not experiencing what Luz did, while vice versa when Luz went into the Borean Isles, but to be honest with you, the montage itself, even if it's supposed to be clever and cute, it just didn't got me invested. And to be perfectly honest, if there was definitely an episode where these characters are being in this position, then I'm pretty sure that it was bound to happen eventually. I'm just saying, it's one thing to make multiple filler episodes, but at the same time, it's mostly in favor of making other episodes that focuses on the development and execution of multiple characters that can easily been a lot more better than what we ended up getting here. Anyway, if the main attention of the episodes while Luz is in the human world is mainly hanging out with the other characters that are basically from the human world, I can guarantee you that there would have been a lot more than what we ended up getting. I mean, granted, it may be overthinking, but at the same time, knowing full well that Luz is dealing with a lot of struggles that she ended up helping out the main antagonist and making everyone else's lives even worse. She would have experienced a lot of conflict emotions when it comes to her wrongdoings, knowing how that she wants to make things right for everyone around her, and yet at the same time she's dealing with a handicapped situation where no one will understand what she feels. I'm gonna be really honest with you that ever since I've been watching the series from seasons 1 through 3 basically, is mainly of how Luz was executed in the earlier seasons, mainly season 1, and how she's developed a lot more better in the second season, to the point that she's experiencing on being a witch, all the while dealing with struggles that most of everything that she does on being into her fantasy element is mainly her biggest flaw. The other characters, mainly Amity and the others, do have flaws, which have been explored through the majority of the series, but at the same time, in comparison of Luz, who is a human, it really feels like a huge difference that you can instantly separate Luz from the others, knowing how that Amity had been dealing with struggles with her family, all the while that the other characters have executions that instantly make them a lot more different compared to Luz. Like, there are weirdos, but they're also weirdos from a different point of view from their lives. Everyone has a life of their own, but unlike Luz's, they're witches. And considering that they're weirdos in their own way, they're not the same as Luz, even though that she is a weirdo. Considering of how difficult it is for Luz to come clean on the fact that everything is her fault, since that she agreed and helped out Belos rather than standing in her own ground. Luz is mainly in a handicapped position while the other characters aren't in a handicapped position. That really showcases of how much that Luz's struggles is a lot more bigger compared to what other people think. And with this being intact with Camellia's development on being supportive towards Luz, all the while not being a good mother, I have to admit that everything is connected all in this one special, and it's just a shame that it hasn't been expanded into multiple episodes. Like, this special does a good job when it comes to doing everything at once, but at the same time, it could have been a lot more. And believe me when I say this. once we get into the climax, it really shows that there would have been a lot more involving Honto's character if we get more screen time of him. The climax centers around Belos possessing Honto to the point that he is unable to save himself from the possession when it comes to Belos' powers. I'm gonna be really honest with you, the fact that Belos possessing Honto being part of the climax while the other characters are trying to stop him is a really interesting climax to say the least. Like, I've completely seen of what Honto went through, so seeing him being possessed while being the antagonist, mainly Belos possessing him, is a good ideal. And considering that the animation by one of the animators that did a very good job, it really shows on Toei that these have taken a long time to premiere. Granted, it could be other situations, but for me personally, whenever I look at the animation when it comes to sequences like this, especially the kiss of Luz and Amity from the second to last episode of Season 2, I'm starting to convince that they really want to make these moments really good when it comes to the animation. And the way that Belos killed Flapjack, who is Honto's palismant, it really shows of how much that Luz's struggles is starting to get a lot more worse from here on out. Believe me when I say this, I'm not really much of a fan when it comes to the palismant of witch hunters, but considering that they're literally the only things that they have some kind of emotion towards when it comes to feeding them and using them for combat, yeah, I'm starting to convince that Honto would probably been dead if his palismant Flapjack didn't save him. I'm gonna be really honest with you, the more I realize these moments, the more I realize of how value the characters are when it comes to their character traits. Even though that this special had to take a time skip of months to get to this moment, which could have led to more ideals along the way, I have to admit that this scene itself of Flapjack bringing Hunter to life is pretty much one of the best moments from the series. I would have said this if Season 3 had more episodes, making this one of the best moments, but at the same time, it tried. It really tried. And I appreciate its effort. While this special isn't one of my favorites when it comes to this show, especially when it comes to the following two episodes, I have to admit, it tried. And the same thing applies to the other episodes. Well, they tried with the amount of time that they have. And believe me when I say this, I didn't talk about V, considering that I did discuss about her character in yesterday's live, but at the same time, I didn't really have much to discuss about her in this, considering that she has little to work with, knowing full well that if this season had more episodes, she would have contributed at least a little bit more rather than what she ended up getting. And the only thing I actually liked from her is that towards the end where the characters go to the Boiling Isles, she forgot that Luz's mother has the car keys. In all honesty, I've seen better jokes that wrapped up when it comes to that type of humor, but that doesn't mean that this joke wasn't funny. It's really humorous. With that being said, I'm giving thanks to them an 8 out of 10, which translates us to the following episode for the future. If I'm going to be perfectly honest, if this show was taking inspiration from Amphibia, where the characters go back to the fantasy world in order to deal with so much consequences going on due to the bad guy having the upper hand, then this will probably be Amphibia 2.0 when it comes to the first half having experiences in Luz's world, while the other half is mainly back to the Boiling Isles. I'm just saying this right now with the similarities of these two shows have. It's honestly surprising to think that these two shows never had a real crossover aside from voice actors voicing out the scripts and conventions in order to make the crossover work. Granted, it's better than nothing, but whenever I think about these comparisons, it really sums up a lot that people really wanted a crossover of Euphemia and the Owl House. With the main characters back to the boring isles, due to the Collector changing everything around him in order to be more fantasy-like and happy-like, yeah, everyone aside from Luce and her mother did not like anything, and they consider it as wrong. It's honestly hilarious to think that these characters that ended up becoming more mature, well, aside from Gus and Willow, really have experienced a lot more differently when it comes to how they were matured a lot more differently, while Luce didn't felt mature like the others. And with the Collector becoming one of the main protagonists, up until the last episode, while in this he's mostly an antagonist who is misunderstood, yeah, it would have been a lot more better if we actually have more screen time and development of him if we had more episodes, but more on that later. The main characters have to go to Hexside School because it's mainly a quarantine building due to what is happening in the outdoors. You know, considering that this came out 3 months ago, which was around the time where the pandemic is officially dead, thanks to the planet nearly coming back to normal despite COVID-19 still being around, I'm pretty sure that this was supposed to be an episode focusing on the situation, on just trying to be under quarantine, but unfortunately they had to scrap it. I know that's not really the case, but believe me when I say this, whenever I look at these moments here and there, it just gave me more ideas of what the show would have been like if it had more episodes. I'm also starting to convince that Bartholomew, who was once an antagonist towards Gus in one of the episodes from Season 2, I'm pretty sure that there will have been another episode focusing on the two when it comes to working together as a team, but believe me when I say this, as much as that idea would have worked out, I'm pretty sure it would have been predictable, which is pretty much one of the only examples that a few episodes aren't really a good idea when it comes to doing a third season. But at the same time, other episodes that favor on doing better than that is a huge exception and mostly an excuse. I'm just saying this right now. As much as I do not like Bartholomew as much as other people do, I can still say for a fact that even if he has an episode with Gus being a team, I'm pretty sure that there will have been a lot of shenanigans or basically disagreements along the way. Maybe it's me and my lack of knowledge of mainly characters like Bartholomew, but at the same time it's difficult to get into every single character. And when it comes to Basha, knowing full well of how Amity has changed, yeah, I'm pretty sure we will probably have a similar episode structure involving the two. Not to say that they can't do anything original or something different, but considering the way that these two characters are executed with Amity having development while Basha is mainly obsessed with Amity, I'm starting to convince that she is dealing with quarantine fever, or basically anything fever due to the circumstances of what is going on. Everything outside of Hexside. Mainly the school, that is. Look, I'm not saying that these ideals are bad or lazy, but considering that this is way too similar when it comes to the concepts of the Euphemia's second half of Season 3, I'm really convinced that this is definitely Euphemia 2.0. Not to say that it's a bad thing, but knowing full well that there are a lot of similarities, especially similarities from other Disney cartoons from the past. Disney Channel really has a thing of connecting the shows with each other when it comes to a few elements. Maybe it's mainly the fact that Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network, despite being different from each other, don't have these types of elements. But I gotta say, Disney Channel really has a thing when it comes to these cartoons, considering that they were made in the studio itself. Granted, I could be wrong, but at the same time, I know Euphemia, the Owl House, and the Ghost and Marty McGee were part of the Disney Channel studio when it comes to making these shows. So, from my knowledge, they pretty much took notes when it comes to inspiration and just uses them in their own shows. You know, I don't know if it's fascinating the fact that Disney Channel is capable of making similar concepts and making them into their own without any plagiarism or whatsoever by changing the designs of reform humans into creatures or magic abilities, and the fact that they managed to make each sequences different and unique in their own way that just raises a lot more questions than answers. I'm not really much of a Disney Channel cartoon expert when it comes to these ideas, but believe me when I say this, when I noticed this in Euphemia and screenshots from Star vs. the Forces of Evil, and also the Ghost and Marty McGee, it really says a lot of how the writing in this show just feels a lot more odd when it has similarities from those shows, mainly Amphibia. With that out of the way, let's go talk about the Collector and Kane. Since that this is the first time we get to see him in a major role, while the last time we saw him was in the final episode of Season 2, I have to admit, there was a lot more that we could have seen from the Collector, and considering the screen time that he has in this, the only thing that we get from him is that he's in denial and he isn't like everyone else, and even when he has the same qualities as Luce, it doesn't change the fact that he was in a position that he was trapped from anything, all the while that Luce was in the outside, in the human world, while still exposing her hobbies and obsessions that make her weird. I'm just saying this right now that the Collector is weird, but compared to Luce, he's weird, but at the same time, he uses his wielder powers to make his real world a reality. And I'm gonna be really honest with you, if we had more episodes focusing on him and how his development would have been a lot more executed more compared to what we ended up getting now, I'm starting to convince that he would have been a lot more better than what we ended up getting. Like, I understand that his execution in this and the following episodes is good, but believe me when I say this, whenever I see the Collector in this predicament and how he didn't get a lot of screen time, it's honestly a shame that the more I realize of what I said in my first review of the first episode of The Owl House sums up a lot of how that comment I made towards it aged poorly. Considering that this is the introduction, we get to see the Boring Isles in the first 4 minutes of this episode, people are going to instantly say that the episode is mostly rushed. I would completely disagree with you on that, but at the same time, this episode isn't 44 minutes long, so I don't think that the people who worked on this episode didn't really have the time in order to make the first episode really paced out well. But at the same time, not every premiere needs to be 44 minutes or an hour long in order to make a good impression. Granted, I did state it that the premiere didn't need to be 44 minutes for the world building to flesh out so that the later episodes can do that, but believe me when I say this, I made that review in early 2021, and that was during the time where we didn't even know what was going on when it comes to the production of The Owl House. So, yeah, a lot has changed ever since I made that video 2 years ago, and just by seeing the predicament that The Owl House is in, yeah. And about me saying that The Owl House was basically this decade's version of Adventure Time, it was me stating the story-driven and the world-building and the execution. I didn't intentionally mean the amount of seasons and episodes it's going to get. Like, I was expecting 3 or 4, but with it only having 2 full seasons and 3 44-minute specials in the 3rd season. Oh my god, a lot has changed, and my comment on how that would have helped out the world building as the series progressed has aged a lot poorly than I thought. Now granted, Kane contributes much more when it comes to the Collector's development in this, since that he decides to stay with the Collector to help him out rather than being with Luz and the others, but at the same time, it wasn't enough. Granted, Kane's development in this show is the least of my problems, but for me personally, knowing full well that he's just trying to help out the Collector to the point that he doesn't want him to read anything that he calls out and only reads the stuff that he wrote it in, sums up a lot that there would have been a lot more execution of the Collector's development if we see more of him along with Kane by his side. To be real with you, I'm starting to convinced that Kane's motivation in this special on what he's supposed to do, what's right for him, but also what's right for the Collector, sums up a lot on the fact that when he goes out of his way to go around his back for the sake of helping out Ita, to the point that he would be able to free all of the puppets, not really puppets, but mainly the people that were turned into puppets, all the while finding a different solution to trap the Collector rather than doing the same thing as before. Kane has gone a long way since the beginning of the series for how different he was back then. And let me tell you, it's a shame that we're never going to see more scenes between him and the Collector when it comes to the relationship. And even though that Kane may go behind his back down the line, he has no other choice. And considering that the Collector is aggressive when it comes to people not being nice, believe me, once we get into his backstory in the next episode, I'm just going to say this right now that it could have been fleshed out a lot more, even though that showing is important, but at the same time, more showing is also another thing. When it comes to the climax, it's not better compared to the last climax when it comes to Kikimora taking control of Ebony's mother's inventions or magical elements or whatever you call them. But if I'm gonna be really honest with you, knowing full well that Luz and the others are trying everything to save the Bowling Isles, they literally have no other choice, knowing full well that Hexside is in a quarantine situation where they don't have any other option, and their lives have become a lot more complicated. And I'm starting to convince that peer pressure and other anxiety issues is what causes other people like Kikimora to do these types of things, because they want to do what's best for them, but not what's best for other people, since that they see what's best in a different way compared to what they think. If I'm gonna be really honest with you, this is the only originality that this has to offer compared to Euphemia. Well, it's mainly going to war, and at the same time, people aren't going against each other. Granted, they do need to find new recruits, but considering that there aren't any recruits completely when it comes to Hexside in this special, there's a lot of boiling points that led to people just losing it and completely just going against each other. Granted, I'm not really an expert of how quarantine works in this type of scenario, but at the same time, when it comes to the Collector taking full control of the Bowling Isles to turn it into his own fantasy, I'm pretty sure anything is possible if it's in a zombie apocalypse or not. And since it leads to a really great scene between Camellia and Luz on the fact that Camellia also had a tough time growing up in the same ways as Luz, I can totally see onto why the image I've seen throughout Twitter and DeviantArt has become a really huge deal. And since I used that image as part of my community post and Twitter post nearly a month ago, this is peak animation and also peak storytelling, considering that Luz just wanted to be understood by at least someone, and with that someone being her mother, is one of the examples onto why I miss these types of developments in animation. And it's just a shame that of how hard that the show tries, it's never going to convince anyone, and when I mean anyone, the Disney executives. And since this also concludes Hunter's struggle, since that he has Flapjack's magic to save Gus and Willow, I have to admit, the quote that he said, "the magic of friendship," is really humorous, since that's a quote from My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, even though I'm not a fan of that show anymore. But at the same time, I really found this moment really good when it comes to Hunter helping out Gus and Willow. Let me just say this right now. This special, even though it has problems of its own, I still enjoy it in the same ways as the last special. Trust me when I say this, the more you realize of how I appreciate this show back then, I want to see more, mainly Luce's new palismant that is a snake. Granted, I understand that's too much to ask, but at the same time, you would probably want to see an episode focusing on Luce and her palismant. Just admit it. I'm giving this episode an 8 out of 10, which is the same rating as the last episode, which leads us to watching and dreaming. This series finale being a week old by tomorrow, I enjoyed it more than the last two that I've already discussed. But believe me when I say this, even with everything, the climax, the fight battle, and the ending itself after the credits, I knew full well that this would have been a lot more, just like the last two specials. The beginning of this finale is really great, and considering that it put characters to the test like Luce, and the fact that we get to see a great climax between Belos and Luce, I have to admit, this would have been a lot more better if we had more episodes, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but believe me when I say this, even though that this finale is great, it still would have been more better. After Luce reunites with Kane and Ita, they need to figure out a way to get out of the world that they're in, while trying to convince the Collector to join them on their side after knowing full well that everything isn't what it seems to be from his point of view. And after a montage of playing games with the Collector, which I'm starting to convince it would have had an episode of its own, even if it may be for filler, he expresses his backstory. Well, he felt loneliness and betrayed with the Titans abandoning him and making him the bad guy. If I'm gonna be really honest with you, this speaks Spinel being abandoned from Steven Universe all over it, and considering that the execution from that film of Spinel has more of a reasoning, I'm starting to convince that they just didn't know what to do with the Collector's development with the time that they have when it comes to this finale. Let me tell you right now that when I stated about the Collector playing games with the other characters being mostly a filler episode at most, that doesn't automatically mean that it should eliminate all this development, because there would have been a lot more involving the Collector's development if we actually had more episodes. And let me tell you, for the majority of this finale, even if the Collector isn't familiar with anything that happens around him since that he was being sealed for so long, and he's supposed to experience sadness while he cries, knowing full well that Luce is officially gone, I have to admit, they're good, but at the same time, there could have been a lot more involving the execution. And considering that the majority of this special, mainly from the beginning and towards the middle, centers around the Collector just trying to figure out what fun is really like, and not being completely of a weirdo like the other characters, except that he's more of a weirdo since that he's been sealed away. there was a lot more development involving the Collector, and not to be mean or anything, like, I understand that he's supposed to be different from the other characters, but at the same time, it's really depressing that this is literally what he ended up getting, considering that there was not a lot of execution in time and screen time that he has due to the predicament that the Owl House was, until it ended nearly a week ago. I know I'm asking for too much, and there's a difference of less is more and how quantity can be an issue, but whenever I look at these moments here involving the Collector along with Luce and the others, there's just so much that it hasn't been explored, and regardless if there was going to be filler episodes or they were going to be, moments like this just make me ashamed that the Owl House just hasn't been explored enough in order to have more moments that would have been a lot more better than what we ended up getting. Like, the moments in this are good. In fact, I can instantly say that the climax, which I'm going to be getting to much later, is really great. But at the same time, with these moments being cut down due to Disney executives, it's really a shame. Here's the thing. When I first watched the final 2 episodes of Euphemia, mainly the 44-minute special and the 22-minute finale, I honestly felt unsatisfied, mainly the fact that there was a lot going on in other shows, and The Owl House is one of them. It may have nothing to do with Euphemia whatsoever, since it got the treatment it got, but compared to The Owl House, it's complicated to appreciate the good qualities, knowing full well that there was some left missing. And even though that what this special and finale did its justice correctly, that doesn't automatically mean that they succeeded on being a better finale than what they ended up being instead. Granted, I'm going to be discussing all that after I express my thoughts towards this finale, but let me tell you, this trilogy video wasn't complicated like the other ones I did in the past, but considering that my knowledge towards this show, not really the best when it comes to all the characters, but when it came to the point of being really disappointed of how the treatment affected so many elements, you can easily tell onto why I consider this the adventure time of this decade, even though that this and Adventure Time are completely different from each other. So just when the Collector was about to stop Bellows, Luce saves him from dying, and when I say dying, I literally meant it. And to be fair, when it comes to Anne's death from Euphemia's finale, this death was a lot more severe, knowing full well that Bellows was a lot more menacing compared to the antagonist from Euphemia, Cain Andreas. Since that Bellows has no regrets and basically really manipulative towards characters like Luce, and when it comes to Cain Andreas, even though that he had reasons on being evil, at the end of the series he ended up becoming a good guy, which is something that Bellows doesn't do whatsoever. And with the Collector not realizing what death actually feels like, since that this is the first time he experienced death in front of his eyes, while Cain and Ida have raw emotions, I still do not understand onto why that the treatment in this show still has that poor treatment, unlike other shows. Like, does Disney executives see these shows as mainly their own thing rather than looking into the fan base? Seriously, as much as Nickelodeon is terrible when it comes to their treatment towards shows, at the very least, they can instantly tell the fan base involving SpongeBob is huge and they don't want to give that up. You know, whenever I look at these moments, I'm supposed to cry and feel raw emotions like the characters aside from the Collector and Bellows are feeling, but let me tell you, I really found it a lot more insulting knowing full well that the treatment is what's overshadowing this show the most from my point of view. And even if you may agree with me or not, that's really how I felt when I gave up watching this show up until this point. Like, I wasn't expecting the death from Luz saving the Collector was ever going to happen, since I wasn't expecting that type of sequence. But at the same time, it still would have been more better if it had the treatment it deserved like other shows. But like I said before, I'm gonna be saving that towards the end. So anyway, we get to see what people like Luz went through when it comes to death. However, she's only mostly dead. Since that, we also get the introduction of Kane's father, who was also one of the Titans of the Boiling Isles. And let me tell you, it's really satisfying to see Papa Titan in this, considering of how much that Kane really misses him. And if I'm gonna be really honest, I'm not even sure if the original plans was to have Kane meet Papa Titan no matter what. Like, if the show had a proper full third season, I'm pretty sure that we would still have the same result of Luz meeting Papa Titan without one scene of Kane meeting Titan, or basically his father, for the first time in forever. And since that this also concludes on the fact that Belos wants to be a hero in his own delusional way rather than not thinking about others, I have to admit, if I rewatch the series involving Belos, I would probably learn more about his character, but considering that, for what I know, that he manipulates Luz and it led to dangerous scenarios of having Luz and her friends to be in, this show has aged a lot more better compared to how it was in the past. Like in 2020, I know for a lot of people were criticizing the full season of the show, and then later on they soon to regret those criticisms, and then upon the second season came around, a lot has improved. And believe me, even though I stated earlier that nothing would have changed involving the interactions of Luz in Papa Titan, in this, if this show ever had a proper full third season, you can tell the dedication and admiration was put into this show, that the contributions at the end just doesn't mean much when it's still doing its job. And believe me, if this show ended up becoming much more worse, I can totally understand Disney's decision on scrapping plans. But considering that they just do not see the treatment and admiration that the show got, then all I can think of is, how is it even possible for a show like this to have this treatment? Just how? And the bit of Luz becoming a Titan Witch after coming back from the dead, I love it. I really, really love it. Which is something that I do not express after many years of reviewing media ever since I started back in 2016. And while I understand that this is only going to happen once in the series, since that it was bound to happen eventually, I can even say that this is even better than the power-ups that Anne and her friends had from Euphemia, because it really feels so unique seeing Luz in this position in order to stop Belos while saving the Boiling Isles. It's really impressive to see Luz having this development and having a climax that really makes this all the more wholesome, and the fact that it really feels satisfying to have a climax that really feels a lot more better compared to Euphemia's climax, mainly from the final episodes. When it comes to the all in or all out episode, well, Anne needs to save her hometown, I'm pretty sure people wanted that involving the outhouse, but let's be real, it's gonna be difficult to top something like that from Euphemia, which is something that I could give Euphemia points for doing something that the outhouse wouldn't be capable of doing. But in all honesty, I would still prefer this finale of Climax compared to the final episode, the Hollis theme from Euphemia. Because as far as I'm concerned, I love the music and I love everything about it compared to Euphemia. So after Luz whipped out Bellows from the heart in order to save the Borean Isles, we then get a sequence where Bellows is close to dying and he tries to convince Luz, but at the same time, it's also manipulation like before. Which leads to a horrifying death sequence. Well, Bellows is close to dying, but at the same time, you knew that he brought this upon himself, and he really deserves it, considering that Luz isn't going to be fooled anymore, and she's not gonna be trustworthy towards people like Bellows ever again. It's honestly astonishing that I managed to figure out the problems involving Bellows when it comes to how his evilness got the better of him by being the hero that he shouldn't be, instead of just watching more episodes. Mainly from this scene alone. Let me tell you, my emotions through his death were confusing at first, but after thinking about it and after watching these 3 specials, him getting stomped by the other characters was indeed extremely satisfying. The rest of the special's runtime is mainly an epilogue and ending involving Luz going to college after 4 years since the events of the climax and saving the Borean Isles, all the while having a birthday surprise back in the Borean Isles in order to reunite with some of her friends in that location. If I'm gonna be honest, the ending of this is good, and I do admit that there's no tweaks to make this ending as good as it is. But since that this finale has arrived and this series has officially concluded almost a week ago, I need to give my thoughts on these 3 specials sophistically. The first one is good. I think it could have been a lot more. The second, same thing as before with both episodes having 8 out of 10. And when it comes to my rating towards this, it's higher, which is why I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. But believe me when I say this, when there's a lot more to explore involving the Owl House and what I stated in my review of the first episode from this show, a lot just hasn't been the same ever since I've uploaded that video 2 years ago, and since that was in April of 2023, well, the month where the Owl House has officially ended, I really don't know what to expect aside from being mostly satisfied with the show's ending. Believe me, this experience alone sums up a lot onto how my emotions towards this show was a lot more complicated compared to what other people think, despite getting over the politics and how the Disney executives were handling this a lot more poorly compared to other shows. Now, I knew that this show wasn't going to last forever. Like, 3 years is somewhat of a good run for a show to last, and while the hiatuses may have been an issue, but when it came to the hiatuses between seasons 2A and season 2B, when I stated that, mainly the half of season 2 and the other half of season 2 having major delays, I'm really convinced that there was a lot going on behind the scenes to the point that it was a trouble production on putting all of this together, considering that there was a lot more going on when it comes to the executives having last minute decisions when it comes to the Owl House. When they stated that the Owl House didn't fit their image of animation, or mainly the shows in general, it's honestly confusing since in other Disney shows where they have weird setups and plot elements like Kim Possible, where when it comes to spy elements, along with other elements that they did involving Phineas and Ferb, and especially the amphibious show that they worked on, all the while the season 2 episodes were airing just around the time the season 1 episodes of The Owl House were airing in 2020 during quarantine. I just don't get the point of view towards this show. Like, there are all fantasy elements in this, like Star versus the Forces of Evil. Just look at these scenes alone and just tell me that this doesn't fit their image. Granted, it took a while for them to do these episodes, since that the second episode from season 3 came out 3 months ago, but I don't understand what Disney executives mean when this show doesn't fit their image. Just because it's different doesn't automatically mean it's a bad thing. Like, if it was different in a way that just doesn't fit their style completely, mainly of how it doesn't have the elements like the Owl House does, then maybe I would understand. So, whenever I look at these 3 specials back to back, whenever I have the chance, and the fact that it's mainly like this instead of being an entirely fall 3rd season, I felt emotionally confused, especially when I'm emotionally sad after witnessing the news. Like, I understand that some people do not look into the news completely when it comes to avoiding drama and negativity, but at the same time, it's mostly important to look at this information closely and have developed emotions and opinions towards future projects. Because let me tell you, even though I do not use predictions as much when it comes to using them for futures before products comes out, I still, at the very least, keep them to myself, mainly the fact that I was so emotionally upset and depressed on the fact that the treatment of the Owl House was this low. When I say that this show was this decade's version of Adventure Time, it's mainly in the fact that it's gaining the respect it deserves and doing storytelling that people will admire. And even though I did not like the storytelling completely in Adventure Time, I can at least understand onto why people enjoy the storytelling in that show. Watching and dreaming sums up a lot on how it could have been a lot more better if it had more time, along with the previous episodes having more time to do more execution. Because I'm gonna be really honest with you, if we had a finale involving the Owl House with a full 3rd season, I'm pretty sure we would still have a 44-minute or a 50-minute finale involving the Owl House regardless, considering that it would have done a lot more justice when it comes to the characters being fleshed out. Granted, I'm not expecting every single character to have a lot of development before the finale comes, but considering of how people were upset on the fact that the treatment towards this show was that badly, I don't even know what else is. Like, compared to Infinity Train that ended up ending after season 4, at the very least, this show tried to end quickly, but they had no other option. And when it comes to Infinity Train, I was so obsessed with it to the point that I was ranking it on the same levels as The Owl House when it comes to best cartoons of this decade. And while I understand that Infinity Train is technically a 2010s cartoon, considering that the 4th season came out in August of 2019, it doesn't change the fact that it will have increased a lot more better as this decade continues. And I'm still upset that that show came to an end nearly 2 years ago, with tomorrow reaching its 2nd anniversary of its 4th season. I don't know if this show would ever reach to seasonal watch hours if it ended up becoming what it should have been, considering that Gravity Falls only had 2 seasons rather than another season. Well, 3 seasons is most likely the right amount for a show to have. I can't say for a fact that The Owl House would probably been a lot worse, considering that the fan base that it grew along with the execution of the writing has improved as the series continued. There would have been a lot of wixes and chances that this show would have accomplished. I may be glorifying this show way too much, but at the same time, whenever I glorify a show, which is something I don't usually do nowadays, I wanted it to succeed. I wanted to have a perfect run without anything bad in the way. Like, maybe a couple of bad episodes when it comes to poor decisions is acceptable. And to be honest with you, this show did succeed that, but unfortunately due to executives got in the way, I don't even think that this show would have been a lot more better if it had what it had back when it aired in the beginning of 2020, which ends up becoming one of the first cartoons of the 2020s decade. In fandom-wise, it may start before 2020, but at the same time, I still consider this a 2020s cartoon, while also being one of the first ones that kickstart the animation in the 2020s decade. I understand that me glorifying that may be a bit too much, but I actually enjoyed animation to the point that with this being part of my binge watch list, all the while watching other shows during that time when the pandemic was getting worse, it got me into animation a lot more, even if the pandemic never happened. In all honesty, whenever I look at the Owl House from the first season compared to these 3 episodes, I would say a lot has changed and a lot has improved, but at the same time, enough is never enough due to the treatment that this show shouldn't deserve. I don't even think that there was ever going to be another show that ever had this treatment, and even if there were, and I got into it a lot more, then I'm pretty sure that the execution in those shows will probably be slightly better compared to this show, since it does a good job on handling nearly everything. It's one thing to rank this show higher and glorify it as one of the best shows in a long time, but the thing is, before We Bare Bears and Steven Universe, I barely watched anything aside from My Little Pony. So when I got into more cartoons, I was hoping that this cartoon that I started watching back in 2020 was going to be a really great hit in Disney Channel, or mainly Disney in general. So the more I think about it, and the more you think about it, Disney stating that the Owl House just doesn't fit their image is not only an insult, but a very difficult thing to think about after the many cartoons that they air over the past 2 or 3 decades. And I'm not talking about animated films, I'm talking about shows on Disney Channel, and Disney XD if you want to include that. If I got into this show just today, while not making any of the reviews or catching up on anything involving the show, then I wouldn't feel this emotion. And believe me when I say this, it's mostly unexpected for me to view a Disney Channel cartoon that has this treatment from a company that was into animation since the very beginning, about 100 years ago. And the fact that this show got this treatment, it's just unreal. Like, I understand that the executives that we have today aren't the same ones that we had in the past previous decades, and it shows when it comes to the live action remixes of the old animated films coming out way more frequently than before, but I'm gonna be really honest with you, the fact that this doesn't fit their image completely while ignoring the fan base itself, I don't even know what to expect. It just really feels weird, and if it ended up happening with a different show like Amphibia, I'm pretty sure they don't even know what people appreciate in animation, in TV-wise or streaming services-wise. Mainly the fact that this, at the end of the day, is a TV show and not an animated film franchise. And look, I'm fully aware that Disney has a lot of problems. The Star Wars franchise, the Marvel franchise, along with the other franchises that it's handling mainly for bucks and no effort whatsoever. I'm fully aware of all of it. The only reason onto why it didn't bother me that much is that even though that I'm still a fan of Star Wars and Marvel, at the same time, Disney didn't create those IPs. And The Owl House is one of those IPs that they created from the ground up. And the fact that The Owl House had nothing to do with Star Wars or Marvel or even Big City Greens, no kidding, people will complain that Big City Greens is the reason that The Owl House was ended, which I highly disagree, is how my passion in animation got decreased. And even though I got into other shows, it didn't change the fact that the HBO Max and Discovery merger just got in the way to the point that it's really difficult to get back into The Owl House after stopping before the final 2 episodes came out. In all honesty, the world that I had with The Owl House was a really wild world, and even though I got into other shows in the future like The Loud House, I really wanted this show to be a lot more than what it ended up being instead. And even though I understand that people were still satisfied with the finale, I can instantly say for a fact that the more I got into this may ruined my enjoyment, but at the same time, it's also important to see what the show could have been, rather what we ended up getting from it. Even though that there would have been major setbacks when it comes to scrapping ideas like the crossover I mentioned before involving Nis and Amphibia, at the very least, I would still appreciate this show a lot more, and my passion of animation would probably be in a position when it comes to the merger of Discovery and Warner Brothers, but in all honesty, whenever I think about those, it's mainly their own thing, but when it comes to animation-wise, it's gonna be a lot more difficult to get back into animation, considering that as of now, the beginning of the 2020s decade hasn't been kind to animation. So I'm starting to convince that The Owl House, as of now, had a good send-off, but it could have been more better. And for me personally, after witnessing this in the finale, the best to do is just to move on and just focusing on other animation in the meantime. Otherwise, it would have been a lot more complicated for me to get back to this show whenever I feel like it. I did state that I was planning on doing a week dedicated to this show by reviewing 5 episodes, and even if I did not keep that promise, I would have think about it as time went on. But since time went on and all this ended up happening, I don't think it's gonna be possible for me to even do a week dedicated to The Owl House. Like, I didn't discuss nearly everything involving the other characters who have a major role in the finale. It's mainly my lack of knowledge, but at the same time, it's mainly the depression that I dealt with when it came to the treatment of this show that pushed me back from doing any more research from this show before doing a video like this. In all honesty, this road was way more complicated, and the fact that I managed to make this video way earlier rather than later this month really sums up a lot that I want to get this out of the way before The Owl House's excitement when it comes to its finale dies down. So yeah, that was my review of The Owl House's fantasy trilogy, from Thanks to Them to Watching and Dreaming. In all honesty, I've went through so much emotions on making this video, and the fact that this didn't ended up becoming one of the hardest videos I have ever made really shows that my knowledge towards this show, when it comes to the production behind this show, is saying a lot. I know I may be overdramatic, but at the same time, this was one of the first shows that I binge-watched before I binge-watched other cartoons afterwards. So in the meantime, I'm gonna be taking a break from this show and focusing on other material in the meantime. When it comes to getting back to the show, that's mainly up to me whether I feel like it. And about me doing a week dedicated to the show, it's a possibility, but it's mainly low on my list at the moment. So all in all, the finale is good, but it could have been better, but at the same time, at least it manages to get a finale. I'm Lonely Fanboy 40 here, and bye to the outhouse.